The eviction notice felt like a physical blow, the paper cut drawing a line of crimson on my finger mirroring the deeper wound in my soul. I stared at the words, each syllable a hammer blow to the foundation of my life. My mother's signature mocked me from the bottom of the page, a twisted parody of the woman who used to read me bedtime stories. They thought kicking me out would solve everything. They were wrong, it was just the beginning. If you have a sister who means the world to you, subscribe now. My name is Stephanie, and up until a few weeks ago, my life was normal, maybe even idyllic. I lived in the house I grew up in, a sprawling Victorian with peeling paint and a garden overflowing with roses that my grandmother had planted. It was more than just a house, it was a repository of memories, each room echoing with laughter, tears, and the comforting rhythm of family life. My mother, Carol, had inherited the house from my grandmother, and upon Carol's passing, the house was to be divided between me and my younger brother, Mark. We were close, or so I thought. Mark was the golden child, the athlete, the charmer. I was the quiet one, the artist, content to live in the background, supporting his ambitions, celebrating his victories. I'd always believed our bond was unbreakable, forged in the shared experiences of childhood, the whispered secrets in the attic, the scraped knees and comforting hugs after a fall. Dad had passed away when I was young, so Mark and I leaned on each other. Carol was always kind to me. When I was younger, she used to let me paint murals in my room, filling the walls with fantastic creatures and vibrant landscapes. She encouraged my creativity, enrolling me in art classes and proudly displaying my work. She had always been the rock of our family, the glue that held us together after Dad left this world. Mark began to excel in sports, she never missed a game. Carol would cheer him on from the sidelines. After the games, she'd take us out for ice cream, celebrating his wins. But when Carol started to get sick, everything changed. The vibrant woman I knew faded, replaced by a gaunt figure consumed by illness. Mark, seemingly motivated by some newfound sense of responsibility, stepped up, handling the finances, managing her medications, and essentially running the household. I was grateful, believing he was simply being a supportive brother. I was too naive to see the subtle shifts in power, the way he subtly began to isolate me from my mother, poisoning her thoughts against me. Carol's health declined rapidly. The doctors told us there was nothing more they could do. Mark became increasingly protective of her, limiting my visits, claiming I was upsetting her. I trusted him, believing he knew what was best. I wasn't prepared for what came next. I walked into the living room one afternoon to see them both sitting on the couch together. Mark had a stack of papers in front of him, and Carol had a pen in her hand. It was a will, rewritten to exclude me entirely, leaving everything to Mark. The person I trusted most was one of them. They claimed I was irresponsible, incapable of managing my inheritance, that I would squander it away on frivolous pursuits. They painted a picture of me as a flighty, unreliable artist, someone undeserving of the family legacy. They wanted me gone. And soon, I was. The eviction notice was the final straw, the period at the end of a sentence I didn't even know I was writing. I packed my belongings, the weight of each item a physical manifestation of my grief and anger. I looked around the house one last time, etching every detail into my memory: the sun-drenched kitchen where my father taught me to bake, the living room where we gathered around the fireplace on Christmas Eve, the garden where my grandmother's roses bloomed in a riot of color. All of it was now lost to me, stolen by the people I had loved and trusted most. I walked out the front door, the slam echoing behind me like a door closing on a chapter of my life. I had nowhere to go. My savings were meager, barely enough to cover a few weeks in a cheap motel. I spent my days searching for a job, any job, but the rejections piled up like unopened bills. Landlords turned me away, citing my lack of references and unstable employment history. The weight of my situation pressed down on me, suffocating me, stealing my breath. I tried to talk to Mark, to reason with him, to appeal to whatever shred of decency might still remain. He refused to see me, his secretary relaying his message that he was too busy to deal with my drama. My friends, sensing the shift in power, began to distance themselves, their invitations drying up, their phone calls becoming less frequent. I was alone, adrift in a sea of uncertainty and despair. Sleepless nights were filled with replays of the will reading, Carol's signature burned in my brain. I tossed and turned, plagued by nightmares of the house, the roses turning black, the walls closing in on me. During the day, I would sit in coffee shops for hours nursing one drink, sketching furiously in my notebook, trying to find some solace in my art, but the inspiration had dried up, replaced by a gnawing emptiness. One evening, as I was walking back to the motel, a wave of dizziness hit me. I stumbled, collapsing onto the sidewalk. When I came to, I was surrounded by strangers, their faces etched with concern. They helped me to my feet, offering me water and a place to sit. It was then that I realized how far I had fallen, how close I was to the edge. I had to do something. I started documenting everything. Every interaction, every phone call, every email. I knew I needed proof, something concrete to fight back against their lies. I started digging into Mark's finances, poring over old bank statements and tax returns. It was tedious work, but I was driven by a burning desire to expose the truth. I visited my mother's old friends, people who had known her for years, hoping they could shed some light on Mark's behavior. I showed them the will, their faces registering shock and disbelief. They told me stories about Carol, about her unwavering belief in fairness and justice, about her love for me. They confirmed my suspicions that Mark had manipulated her, isolating her from her friends and family, poisoning her mind against me. The more I learned, the angrier I became. They thought they could break me, that they could steal my inheritance and leave me with nothing. They underestimated me. I would fight back. I would expose their lies. I would reclaim what was rightfully mine. I started to formulate a plan, a meticulously crafted strategy to dismantle their carefully constructed facade. It would be risky, but I was willing to do anything to achieve justice. My vision blurred, the glass in my hand shattered. I will make them pay. The motel room became my prison. The stained carpets, the flickering fluorescent lights, the constant hum of the air conditioner, they were all constant reminders of my failure. The money was running out. Each meal was a calculation, a choice between sustenance and survival. The weight of despair threatened to consume me, to drag me down into an abyss from which there was no return. One particularly bleak morning, I woke up to find a notice slipped under the door, my time was up. I had no money to pay for another night. I was officially homeless. Walking out of that motel felt like stepping off the edge of the world. The sun seemed to mock me, its warmth a cruel reminder of the comfort and security I had lost. I wandered the streets aimlessly, my backpack heavy with the few possessions I had managed to salvage. The city, once a place of opportunity and excitement, now felt hostile and indifferent. Every face was a stranger, every doorway a reminder of my exclusion. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, and exhaustion weighed down my limbs. I found myself in a park, surrounded by families picnicking, children playing, their laughter a sharp contrast to the silence within me. I sat on a bench, watching them, a lump forming in my throat. I felt like an invisible ghost, haunting a world I no longer belonged to. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I felt a profound sense of hopelessness wash over me. What was the point? What was the point of fighting, of struggling, when the odds were so overwhelmingly stacked against me? Maybe they were right. Maybe I was a failure. Maybe I was destined to live a life of poverty and despair. I closed my eyes, the image of my mother's face flashing before me. Her smile, her warmth, her unwavering belief in me. And then, a flicker of anger ignited within me. No. I wouldn't let them win. I wouldn't let them break me. I owed it to my mother, to myself, to fight back. I would make them regret the day they betrayed me. This wasn't the end, it was a new beginning. A beginning fueled by rage and a thirst for justice. I spent the night huddled in a doorway, the cold seeping into my bones. Sleep was fitful, haunted by nightmares of Mark and Carol, their faces twisted with malice. But with the first rays of dawn, a new resolve hardened within me. I was done feeling sorry for myself. It was time to take action. I needed a plan, a strategy to dismantle their carefully constructed lies. I started by focusing on Mark's weaknesses. He was arrogant, greedy, and convinced of his own invincibility. He believed he was smarter than everyone else, that he could get away with anything. That was his downfall. His arrogance would be his undoing. I remembered a conversation I had overheard between Mark and one of his business associates, something about shady deals and offshore accounts. At the time, I hadn't paid much attention, but now it sparked an idea. I needed to find proof, concrete evidence of his illicit activities. I spent days scouring public records, searching for any trace of financial impropriety. It was like searching for a needle in a haystack, but I refused to give up. I haunted the local library, poring over old newspapers and legal documents. I learned how to navigate the complex world of corporate finance, how to trace money through shell corporations and hidden accounts. The more I learned, the more determined I became. I discovered a pattern of suspicious transactions, a web of deceit that implicated Mark in a series of fraudulent schemes. He had been siphoning money from the family business, using it to fund his lavish lifestyle and to line his own pockets. The evidence was damning. But I needed more. I needed something that would expose him beyond any doubt. I remembered Carol's old journals, stashed away in the attic of the house. They were filled with her thoughts, her dreams, her secrets. I knew Mark would never look at them, he considered them sentimental garbage. But I suspected they might contain clues, something that could help me understand his motivations, his vulnerabilities. Getting into the house would be risky, but I was willing to take the chance. I waited until nightfall, the darkness my ally. I scaled the back fence, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was silent, eerily so. I crept through the garden, the familiar scent of roses filling my nostrils. I found the attic window unlocked, a forgotten oversight. I slipped inside, my senses on high alert. The attic was dusty and cluttered, filled with forgotten relics of our family history. I started searching, carefully sifting through boxes and trunks. Hours passed, and I was about to give up when I found it, a small, leather-bound journal hidden beneath a pile of old photographs. I opened it, my hands trembling. Carol's familiar handwriting filled the pages, her words a window into her soul. As I read, I discovered a secret, a dark truth that shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. Mark wasn't just greedy, he was ruthless. He had manipulated Carol, playing on her fears and insecurities, poisoning her mind against me. He had isolated her from her friends and family, controlling her every move. And he had been stealing from her for years, draining her bank accounts, forging her signature on legal documents. The truth was even more twisted and evil than I had imagined. Rage surged through me, a white-hot fury that burned away all traces of doubt and fear. They had taken everything from me, but they wouldn't get away with it. I would expose them, I would make them pay for their crimes. I closed the journal, my grip tightening. The game had changed. It was no longer just about reclaiming my inheritance, it was about justice. It was about protecting my mother's legacy. It was about vengeance. I smiled, a cold, determined smile. The plan was taking shape. I emerged from the attic, Carol's journal clutched tightly in my hand. The plan was no longer a vague idea, but a concrete strategy, a series of calculated moves designed to bring Mark and his accomplice crashing down. I had to be smart. I couldn't just barge in and accuse them. I needed proof, undeniable evidence that would stand up in court. The first step was to gather as much information as possible about Mark's financial dealings. I remembered him bragging about using encrypted messaging apps to communicate with his business partners. If I could gain access to those messages, I would have everything I needed. I found a cheap, burner laptop at a pawn shop and started teaching myself digital forensics. Late into the night, I watched tutorials on data recovery, encryption cracking, and network security. It was a steep learning curve, but I was determined to master it. My artistic skills, honed over years of practice, proved surprisingly useful. I was able to create convincing fake emails and documents, designed to lure Mark into revealing his secrets. It was a dangerous game, but I was playing to win. The next few weeks were a blur of research, planning, and preparation. I set up fake social media profiles, posing as a potential investor interested in Mark's business ventures. I baited him with promises of lucrative deals, subtly steering the conversation towards his offshore accounts and questionable transactions. He took the bait, hook, line, and sinker. His arrogance blinded him to the trap I was setting. He readily shared details about his financial empire, bragging about how he had outsmarted everyone, including our own mother. I recorded every conversation, every email, every text message. I knew I only had one shot at this, so I had to make it count. I also needed to address the issue of the will. Carol's journal provided a clear motive for Mark's actions, but it wasn't enough to invalidate the document. I needed to prove that he had exerted undue influence over her, that he had manipulated her into changing her will against her true wishes. I contacted a lawyer, a seasoned professional who specialized in estate disputes. I showed him the journal, explained the situation, and laid out my evidence. He was skeptical at first, but the more he heard, the more intrigued he became. He agreed to take my case, pro bono. The lawyer advised me to gather testimonies from Carol's friends and acquaintances, people who could attest to her state of mind in the months leading up to her passing. I tracked down her old friends, the ones Mark had isolated her from. They were shocked to learn about the will, and eager to help me expose the truth. They provided sworn statements, detailing Mark's controlling behavior, his constant disparagement of me, and his attempts to alienate Carol from her loved ones. With each piece of evidence I gathered, my confidence grew. The plan was coming together, meticulously, piece by piece, like a complex puzzle. I knew the risks were high, but I was prepared to face them. I had come too far to turn back now. One afternoon, while I was reviewing the recorded conversations with Mark, I noticed something strange. He kept referring to a specific date, a date that coincided with Carol's last visit to the hospital. I cross-referenced that date with her medical records, and discovered something truly disturbing. Mark had increased her dosage of a certain medication, a medication that could have potentially hastened her passing. It was a subtle change, easily overlooked, but the implications were devastating. He hadn't just manipulated her, he had actively contributed to her health decline. The rage I felt was unlike anything I had ever experienced. My vision blurred, and the cheap plastic of the laptop threatened to shatter in my grip. This wasn't just about money or inheritance, it was about something far more sinister. He had betrayed our mother in the most unspeakable way. I knew I had to proceed with caution. Accusing him of foul play without solid proof would be reckless. I needed to consult with a lawyer to determine the best course of action. I spent the next few days meticulously gathering evidence to support my suspicions. I contacted a medical examiner, discreetly requesting a review of Carol's medical records. The examiner confirmed that the increased dosage of medication could have had a detrimental effect on her health, especially given her weakened condition. He couldn't definitively say that it had caused her passing, but the possibility was undeniable. Armed with this new information, I met with my lawyer. He listened intently, his expression growing increasingly grim. He advised me to contact the authorities, to report my suspicions to the police. It was a risky move, but it was the right thing to do. I spent hours at the police station, recounting my story, presenting my evidence. The detectives were initially skeptical, but the more they investigated, the more convinced they became that something was amiss. They launched a formal investigation, interviewing Mark, his business associates, and Carol's medical team. The pressure was mounting. I knew it was only a matter of time before Mark realized that he was under suspicion. I had to be ready for anything. I installed security cameras in my motel room, just in case. I changed my phone number, using a prepaid burner phone. I didn't trust anyone. I knew Mark was capable of anything. The anticipation was almost unbearable. I could feel the storm gathering, the moment of reckoning drawing near. The day they betrayed me was the day their downfall began. They thought they were untouchable. That was their fatal mistake. The detectives called me in, their faces grim. They had searched Mark's office, his house, his car. They found nothing. He had covered his tracks meticulously, erasing any digital evidence that could link him to Carol's increased medication dosage. My heart sank. It seemed he was going to get away with it. The lawyer tried to reassure me, reminding me that the investigation was ongoing, that they were still interviewing witnesses, still piecing together the puzzle. But I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Mark was too smart, too ruthless. He would find a way to manipulate the system, to escape justice. I spent the next few days in a state of anxious uncertainty, pacing the floor of my motel room, replaying every conversation, every detail, searching for something I might have missed. I needed to find a way to corner him, to force him to confess. Then it hit me, the gala. Mark was hosting a charity gala in a few weeks, a lavish affair designed to showcase his wealth and generosity. It was the perfect opportunity. He would be surrounded by his friends, his colleagues, his benefactors. He would be at his most confident, his most vulnerable. I decided to crash the party. I knew I couldn't just walk in uninvited. I needed a plan, a way to gain access without raising suspicion. I remembered Mark mentioning that he was still looking for a videographer to cover the event. I saw my opening. Using my fake social media profiles, I posed as a freelance filmmaker with experience in high-end events. I sent him a link to a portfolio of my work, mostly stock footage I had downloaded from the internet, and waited. To my surprise, he responded almost immediately. He was impressed with my skills and offered me the job. I negotiated a generous fee, enough to cover my expenses and then some. I had to suppress a smile. He was walking right into my trap. The weeks leading up to the gala were a whirlwind of preparation. I purchased a professional-grade camera and editing software. I studied the guest list, memorizing faces and names. I researched Mark's business partners, his political allies, his social circle. I needed to know everything about everyone. I also spent hours working on a video, a carefully crafted montage of evidence, testimonies, and incriminating recordings. It was the culmination of months of planning, a meticulously constructed narrative designed to expose Mark's crimes and to bring him to justice. The video was my weapon, my ultimate act of vengeance. The night of the gala arrived, a cool evening with the air thick with anticipation. I arrived early, setting up my equipment and scoping out the venue. The ballroom was opulent, adorned with crystal chandeliers, floral arrangements, and expensive artwork. Guests began to arrive, dressed in their finest attire, sipping champagne and exchanging pleasantries. Mark was the picture of success, beaming as he greeted his guests, shaking hands with politicians, and posing for photos with celebrities. I watched him from the sidelines, my heart pounding in my chest. The moment of truth was approaching. As the evening progressed, I mingled with the crowd, discreetly planting microphones and cameras in strategic locations. I wanted to capture everything, every word, every gesture. I needed to ensure that my video had maximum impact. I waited for the perfect moment, the moment when Mark would be at his most exposed. It came during his speech, a self-congratulatory monologue about his achievements and his contributions to society. He stood at the podium, bathed in the spotlight, his face flushed with pride. I knew this was it. I signaled to my accomplice, a tech-savvy friend who had agreed to help me with the technical aspects of the operation. He hacked into the ballroom's sound system, cutting off Mark's microphone. A hush fell over the crowd. Then, the video began to play, projected onto a giant screen behind the podium. The first few seconds were innocuous, a montage of Mark's charitable works. But then, the tone shifted. Images of Carol appeared on the screen, her smile fading into a series of medical reports and legal documents. The audio recordings began to play, Mark's voice echoing through the ballroom, his words laced with greed, arrogance, and deceit. The crowd gasped. Mark's face turned ashen. He tried to stop the video, but it was too late. The truth was out. Every crime, every betrayal, every secret laid bare for all to see. As the video reached its climax, revealing the evidence of Mark's manipulation of Carol's medication, a collective murmur swept through the room. The police arrived, sirens blaring, lights flashing. They moved through the crowd, their eyes fixed on Mark. He stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. The game was over. They had lost everything. I just smiled. But then, as the police placed Mark in handcuffs, his eyes locked with mine. And in that instant, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't defeat. It was pure, unadulterated malice. He whispered something under his breath, something I couldn't quite make out. But I knew, with a certainty that pierced my soul, that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The crimson and blue lights pulsed against the stunned faces in the ballroom, reflecting off the discarded champagne flutes and the horrified eyes of Mark's elite guests. His face, once a mask of smug self-satisfaction, was now a roadmap of crumbling arrogance. The video continued to play, a relentless loop of his lies and manipulations, each frame a hammer blow to his carefully constructed facade. His business partners recoiled, whispering amongst themselves, their alliances visibly fracturing. Politicians distanced themselves, their smiles replaced with tight-lipped disapproval. The socialites, once eager to bask in his reflected glory, now regarded him with a mixture of pity and disgust. As the police led him away, I focused on the whispered words I barely caught, the words that promised more to come. It wasn't a confession, it was a threat. It was a promise of retribution, a vow of unending torment. It was then I knew that true justice wouldn't be achieved in a courtroom, it would be a lifelong battle. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Mark's empire crumbled overnight. His business ventures collapsed, his assets were seized, and his reputation was irrevocably tarnished. His name became synonymous with deceit and betrayal, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones among the wealthy and powerful. He was ostracized, abandoned by his friends and colleagues, left to face the consequences of his actions alone. Carol's friends, the ones he had isolated, flocked to my side, offering their support and their gratitude. They shared stories of her kindness, her generosity, her unwavering spirit. They helped me piece together the fragments of her life that Mark had tried to erase. The lawyer worked tirelessly, navigating the legal complexities, ensuring that Mark was held accountable for his crimes. The will was invalidated, and Carol's estate was distributed according to her original wishes. The increased medication dosage became a key point in the investigation. The medical examiner's testimony, combined with the evidence I had gathered, painted a damning picture. While they couldn't definitively prove intent to unalive, the circumstances were suspicious enough to warrant further investigation. Days turned into weeks. The motel room felt smaller, as the walls of the initial plan faded and were replaced by this new reality. The burner phone remained glued to my hand. I knew he wouldn't go down without a fight. News trickled in about Mark's attempts to secure bail, his frantic calls to his remaining allies, his desperate efforts to salvage what was left of his life. But the damage was done. He had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The police investigation dragged on. The detectives were thorough, methodical, and determined to uncover the full extent of Mark's wrongdoing. They interviewed countless witnesses, scrutinized financial records, and pieced together the puzzle of his life. Finally, the day arrived when the charges were filed. Mark was indicted on multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and elder abuse. The trial was a media circus, a spectacle of accusations, denials, and revelations. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, meticulously documenting Mark's crimes. The defense attempted to discredit my testimony, to portray me as a vengeful and unreliable witness. But the truth was too strong, the evidence too overwhelming. The jury deliberated for days, their faces etched with gravity. Finally, they reached a verdict. Guilty. Mark was convicted on all charges. The judge sentenced him to the maximum penalty. As he was led away, his eyes met mine once more. This time, there was no malice, no threat. Only defeat. In the end, justice was served. Carol's legacy was protected, her memory honored. Mark's reign of terror was brought to an end. The money, the power, the influence, all gone. He lost everything. I just smiled. But the victory felt hollow. The pain of betrayal still lingered, a dull ache in my heart. The memories of Carol haunted me, her laughter, her love, her trust. I knew that nothing could ever truly fill the void she had left behind. I walked away from the courtroom, into the cool night air. The city lights blurred, the sounds of traffic faded into a distant hum. I was alone, but I was free. Free from the burden of revenge, free from the darkness that had consumed me for so long. I looked up at the stars, their light a distant reminder of hope and resilience. The game was over. Revenge isn't sweet. It's necessary. It's a primal instinct, a desperate attempt to right a wrong, to reclaim what has been stolen. But it's also a dangerous path, one that can consume you if you're not careful. I had walked that path, and I had emerged scarred but not broken. I had learned a valuable lesson, that justice is not always swift, but it is always worth fighting for. It was a victory born of necessity, a triumph forged in the fires of betrayal. Would you have done the same? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe for more stories of justice.